Stela 11 at Tikal stands just over 2 meters tall, carved from a single block of pale limestone. On its worn surface, a king sits cross-legged in full ceremonial regalia. Feathered headdress, jade ear spools the face of a deity pressed against his chest. The date carved beside him corresponds to the year 869 AD. It is the last dated monument this city would ever produce. After more than 5 centuries of kings recording their names and victories on stone, the tradition ended here at this slab. No final decree was issued. No farewell was carved. The voice of one of the ancient world's most literate civilizations simply fell silent. That silence is where we begin tonight. Not with the grandeur of the classic Maya at their height, though we will move through it, but with the question the silence leaves behind. Because Tikal was not alone. Palenque carved its last monument around 799 AD. Copan followed in 822. One by one across the southern lowlands of what is now Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico, the great cities stopped speaking. Tonight we follow 3 traces of that long unraveling, what the stones recorded before they went quiet, what the earth preserved after the people left, and what the climate captured in deposits no human hand arranged may tell us about forces the Maya could neither predict nor command. The world these cities belonged to was not a single empire. It was a constellation of independent kingdoms, each ruled by a figure known as the Kuhulajau, the Holy Lord, a divine king whose authority rested on something far more intimate than military power or bureaucratic control. His role was to sustain the order of the cosmos itself. Through elaborate rituals of bloodletting performed with obsidian blades and stingray spines, he offered his own body to the gods. In the smoke of burning blood-soaked paper, a portal was believed to open between the mortal world and the supernatural realm. Through this portal, the king petitioned the gods and ancestors for one thing above all others: rain. Rain to fill the massive stone reservoirs, rain to nourish the fields of maize. Because maize was not merely food to the classic Maya. It was identity, religion, and survival, woven into a single plant. The entire civilization was in the most literal sense a partnership between a people and a crop, a partnership maintained through the sacred intermediary of the king. This arrangement held for centuries. And during those centuries the Maya achieved things that still quietly astonish. They developed the only complete writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, a sophisticated logosyllabic script that could express anything a spoken language could. They independently invented the concept of zero, a mathematical leap the Romans never made, and used it to build a calendar system of staggering precision. Their long count calendar tracked the number of days elapsed since a mythological creation date in 3114 BC, allowing them to date events across millennia. From observatories atop their limestone pyramids, priest astronomers charted the cycles of Venus and predicted solar eclipses not as abstract science but as acts of devotion, attempts to read the intentions of a universe they believed was written in repeating patterns of time. It was a civilization of remarkable intellectual depth, powered by corn and governed by blood. And yet the environmental foundation beneath all of it was thinner than it appeared. The tropical rainforest of the southern lowlands looks eternally fertile. In reality, its soils are shallow and easily exhausted. Feeding a city like Tikal, which may have supported 60,000 people at its peak, demanded the clearing of enormous stretches of forest for maize cultivation. But agriculture was not the only pressure. The Maya's monumental architecture required something less obvious, and perhaps more destructive lime plaster. Their pyramids and palaces were coated in thick layers of brilliant white stucco, and producing it meant burning limestone at extreme temperatures using vast quantities of green wood. Some estimates suggest that plastering a single Great Pyramid could have consumed nearly 1,000 acres of forest. Multiply that across dozens of competing kingdoms, each building ever grander temples in what amounted to an architectural arms race, and the cumulative toll on the landscape becomes difficult to overstate. Pollen records extracted from lake sediments confirm what this arithmetic implies. In the layers corresponding to the late classic period tree pollen drops sharply, and weed pollen surges. The forest was disappearing. So by the mid-8th century, around 750 AD, DC, the classic Maya world had reached an extraordinary peak and an extraordinary vulnerability. populations were at their highest. The sacred calendar turned its familiar cycles. The divine kings performed their rituals and the cosmic bargain seemed secure. But the soils were thinning, the forests were shrinking, and the margin for any disruption, any failure of the rains, any escalation of the wars that were already a constant feature of political life had narrowed almost to nothing. The civilization was brilliant. It was also by this point brittle. What happened next unfolded not as a single catastrophe, but as a slow compounding pressure that played out differently from city to city, decade to decade, across roughly 150 years. The evidence comes from several independent sources: the abrupt cessation of carved dates on the stelae, the unfinished construction projects abandoned mid-build the hastily erected defensive walls, at once open cities, the mass graves bearing signs of violence, the shifting content of the art itself, which grows grimmer and more chaotic in the final decades. And beneath all of this, recorded in the oxygen isotopes of cave stalagmites and the gypsum concentrations of lakebed cores, a climatic signal that two independent archives agree upon a prolonged severe drought beginning around 750 AD, punctuated by multi-decade mega-droughts, unlike anything the region had experienced in centuries. None of these traces taken alone explains the collapse, but laid together they begin to outline a pattern of accumulating stress of systems that had sustained a civilization for 600 years slowly failing to hold. The warfare that had once been ritualized and limited appears to have spiraled into something more desperate. The sacred promise of the divine kings that their blood could bring the rain was tested year after year against a sky that would not answer. We will not arrive at a single clean verdict tonight. The evidence does not offer one. What it offers instead is a series of quiet converging signals legible in the stones, in the sediment, in the silence itself, that together sketch the outline of how a world comes undone. Not in fire, not in a single dramatic stroke, but slowly, city by city, field by field, until the forest closes over and the last footsteps fade into the green. So we begin where the traces begin, with the cities themselves at the moment they were still speaking. The cities that stopped speaking. In the spring of 1839, near the banks of the Copan River in western Honduras, an American lawyer named John Lloyd Stevens stood before a stone monument half buried in the roots of a strangler fig. The carving on its surface depicted a figure wearing an elaborate headdress, jade ornaments hanging from the ears, a ceremonial bar held across the chest. The stone was weathered, but the detail was extraordinary. Each feather individually rendered, each glyph cut with a precision that spoke of long mastery. Stevens was not an archaeologist. He was a travel writer and diplomat, a man drawn to forgotten places by curiosity rather than academic training. But he understood immediately that what he was looking at could not be dismissed as the work of a minor culture or attributed to some imagined foreign builder. This was something the Western world had not accounted for. A civilization of depth and sophistication had risen in the Americas, flourished for centuries, and then for reasons no one in 1839 could explain had stopped. That pause, that cessation, is the thread we follow tonight. Not the spectacle of collapse as it is sometimes told with drama and finality, but the quieter question underneath: what does it look like when a civilization's voice simply trails off? Stevens had arrived in Central America with Frederick Catherwood, a British architect whose talent for precise illustration would prove as important as any excavation. Catherwood worked in brutal conditions, sweltering heat clouds of insects' hands, swollen from bites, using a camera lucida to project the carved images onto paper so he could trace their details with architectural accuracy. His drawings were not romantic interpretations. They were the first faithful visual records of the Maya world ever produced for a Western audience. And when Stevens published them alongside his travel narrative in Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas and Yucatan, the effect was immediate. The book became an international sensation. It proved that a great indigenous civilization had existed in the Americas, one whose achievements in art and architecture rivaled anything in the ancient Mediterranean. But proving the civilization existed only deepened the mystery. The cities Stevens and Catherwood documented, Copan Palenque, the towering pyramids of Tikal, were empty. Their plazas were choked with vegetation. Their carved monuments lay toppled or half swallowed by tree roots. The questions that would occupy scholars for the next century and a half were already present in Stephen's own journal. Who built these places and why did they leave? The answers, when they began to emerge, did not come quickly. For decades, the elaborate glyphs covering the Maya monuments were assumed to be decorative, symbolic, perhaps religious, but not a true writing system. The influential British archaeologist Sir J. Eric S. Thompson argued forcefully that the carvings recorded astronomical cycles and mystical concepts, not the histories of individual rulers. Under his authority, the Maya were reimagined as peaceful philosopher priests, their cities as ceremonial centres, visited only for rituals, not as the bustling urban capitals they actually were. It was a tidy picture, and it was largely wrong. The first crack came from an unlikely source. In the 1950s, a young Russian linguist named Yuri Knorosov, working in near isolation in a small Leningrad apartment with limited access to Maya texts, proposed something radical. He argued that the glyphs were not purely symbolic. They were phonetic. They represented the sounds of a spoken Mayan language. His work was brilliant, methodical, and almost entirely ignored by the Western academic establishment. Thompson dismissed it publicly. The field moved on, but the idea did not disappear. It sat in the literature like a stone in a still pond waiting. The person who would vindicate Knorosov's insight and transform our understanding of the Maya was not a linguist at all. Tatiana Proskoryakov was a Russian-born architect and illustrator who had spent years producing meticulous reconstruction drawings of Maya cities. Her work required her to study the monuments closely, not just their images, but their arrangement, their repetitions, their patterns. And in the late 1950s, while analysing a series of stelae from the site of Piedras Negras in Guatemala, she noticed something no one else had seen. The dates on each monument at a given site spanned a period of roughly 60 to 80 years, the length of a human life. The earliest date on each sequence was associated with a particular glyph. A later date was paired with a different glyph, and a final date appeared near the end. In a groundbreaking 1960 paper, Proskuryakov demonstrated what these patterns meant. The first glyph recorded a birth, the second an accession to the throne, the third a death. The stelae were not astronomical tables, they were biographies. The Maya had been recording the lives of their kings in stone for centuries and no one had read them. This single discovery, quiet, methodical, built on years of patient observation, changed everything. It meant the glyphs could be read as history. It meant the silent cities had been trying to speak all along. And it meant that the story of the Maya collapse was not a matter of abstract speculation. It was written down in their own words on monuments whose dates could be cross-referenced with a calendar system accurate to the day. What that record reveals once you learn to read it is not a sudden catastrophe. It is something slower, and in its way more unsettling, a gradual narrowing, a thinning of the voice, until the last monument is carved and the chisel is set down for the final time. The silence that follows is not empty. It is full of questions. And the first of those questions concerns the world the Maya built, before it began to unravel a world whose brilliance and whose fragility were, as we will see, two expressions of the same thing. The people of the corn. A jade mask recovered from a royal tomb at Palenque weighs just under 2 kilograms, but the labour it represents is almost beyond calculation. Each piece of jade was cut without metal tools shaped by patient abrasion, with harder stone and fine sand polished until it caught the light of a torch like still green water. Jade to the classic Maya was more precious than gold. It signified breath life, the vital force that moved through all living things. Kings were buried with jade placed in their mouths, a final offering, a seed of continuity between death and whatever lay beyond. The care lavished on a single funerary mask tells us something important about the civilization that produced it. This was not a society operating at the margins of subsistence scrambling to survive. This was a culture with surplus, with specialized artisans with a hierarchy complex enough to channel enormous resources toward objects that would never be seen again once the tomb was sealed. The question then is how such a society was built and sustained in one of the most deceptively difficult environments on Earth. The answer begins with a single plant. Maize corn was the foundation on which the entire classic Maya world rested, and to call it merely a staple crop understates its significance by a wide margin. Maize was food, yes, but it was also cosmology. In the Popol Vuh, the creation narrative of the Quiches Maya, recorded centuries after the classic period but rooted in far older traditions, the gods fashioned the first successful human beings from maize dough, after failed attempts with mud and wood. Humanity in the Maya understanding was literally made of corn. The cycle of planting, growth, harvest and replanting was not just an agricultural routine, it was the central sacred drama of existence, a yearly reenactment of creation itself. Every cornfield was in a sense a temple, every harvest was a small resurrection, and every failure of the crop was a rupture in the cosmic order, a sign that something between the human world and the divine had gone wrong. The environment in which the Maya grew this sacred crop was far less hospitable than the lush green canopy suggests. The southern lowlands of present-day Guatemala and southern Mexico are tropical rainforest, and tropical rainforest soil is notoriously poor. The fertility of the jungle is held not in the earth but in the biomass above it in the trees, the leaf litter the constant cycling of organic material through a living system. Strip that biomass away, and what remains is a thin layer of topsoil over limestone bedrock soil that yields well for a few seasons and then begins to exhaust. The Maya understood this problem intimately, and over centuries they developed sophisticated techniques to work around it. They practiced slash and burn agriculture, clearing small plots of forest, farming them for a few years, then allowing the jungle to reclaim the land while they moved to a new plot. Where the terrain allowed, they built stone terraces into hillsides to retain soil and moisture. In low-lying, swampy areas, they constructed raised fields, elevated planting surfaces surrounded by canals that provided both irrigation and a source of nutrient-rich muck that could be spread as fertilizer. These were not crude adaptations. They were engineering solutions developed over generations, and for a long time they worked remarkably well. But the system had limits, and those limits were set by the interaction between population density and the carrying capacity of the land. A small population could rotate fields, allow fallow periods, and keep the forest's regenerative cycle intact. A large population could not. And by the 8th century AD, the population of the southern lowlands had reached levels that may never have been seen before in the region. Estimates vary, and this is one of those areas where the evidence resists firm conclusions, but the city of Tikal alone may have supported somewhere between 40 and 80,000 people, with dense settlement extending well beyond the ceremonial centre into the surrounding countryside. Across the broader lowlands, total population estimates range from several million to as many as 10 million. Even the conservative figures describe a landscape under enormous pressure, one in which the old strategies of rotation and fallow were being compressed or abandoned entirely in favour of continuous cultivation to feed a growing number of mouths. The margin between sufficiency and shortage was narrowing with each generation, though it is unlikely anyone at the time could have measured it. What held this pressurized system together, what gave it coherence and meaning, was the institution of divine kingship. The Maya did not live in a single unified state. Their political world was a constellation of independent city-states, each governed by a Kuhula-Jah, a holy lord, whose authority derived not from a constitution or a bureaucratic apparatus, but from a sacred claim. The king was the intermediary between the human world and the realm of gods and ancestors. His rituals maintained the cosmic order. His blood offered in ceremonies of extraordinary intensity fed the gods and ensured the continuation of the world. This was not a metaphor to the classic Maya. It was the operating logic of the universe. The king pierced his own tongue, his earlobes, or other parts of his body with obsidian blades or stingray spines, letting the blood fall onto bark paper, which was then burned. In the rising smoke, a vision serpent was believed to appear, a portal through which the king communed with supernatural forces and petitioned them for rain, for victory, for the survival of his people. The reciprocal structure of this covenant is worth pausing over because it explains much of what came later. The commoners farmed the land and paid tribute in maize and labour, The king took that tribute and through his rituals converted it into divine favour, most critically, into the seasonal rains that made the next harvest possible. As long as the rains came and the maize grew, the system validated itself. The king's power was confirmed, the people's faith was renewed, the cycle continued. But the entire arrangement rested on a premise that was, in the end, a profound vulnerability, the belief that a human being could influence the weather. For as long as the climate cooperated, this vulnerability remained invisible, folded neatly into the rhythms of ceremony and harvest. It would not remain invisible forever. What the kings built with the surplus their system generated, and what that building cost the land beneath it, is the subject we turn to next. The white cities and the vanishing forest. It takes approximately 20 tons of dry wood to produce enough lime plaster to coat a single modest Maya structure. For one of the great temple pyramids at Tikal, structures that rose over 60 meters above the forest floor, their surfaces sheathed in thick, smooth stucco that was then painted in vivid red and cream, the calculation becomes staggering. Some archaeologists have estimated that plastering a single major pyramid required the felling of nearly 1,000 acres of surrounding forest, not for construction timber, but purely for fuel to fire the limestone kilns. The number is difficult to hold in the mind. 1,000 acres is roughly the area of a modest modern town reduced to ash and heat, so that one building could gleam white against the green. And Tikal did not build one pyramid. It built dozens over centuries, each successive king compelled by tradition and rivalry to build higher, grander, more brilliantly surfaced than his predecessor. Multiply this across the dozens of competing city-states of the southern lowlands. Calakmul, Copan Palenque, Dos Pilas, Naranjo Caracol, and the cumulative demand on the forest begins to look less like resource use and more like slow-motion transformation of the landscape itself. This is the detail that refuses to simplify. The Maya pyramids, which are among the most celebrated architectural achievements of the ancient world, were not merely built from the forest. They consumed it. The relationship between monumental architecture and deforestation is one of those connections that seems obvious in retrospect, but whose full implications took decades of scientific work to establish. The classic Maya did not have metal tools-wheeled vehicles or draft animals. Every block of limestone was quarried by hand, transported by human labour, and set into place by teams of workers, organised through the tribute system that funneled commoner labour to the royal courts. The raw construction was immense enough, but it was the finishing, the lime plaster, that placed the heaviest burden on the environment. Producing plaster required heating crushed limestone to temperatures above 900 degrees Celsius, a process that demanded enormous sustained fires fed by freshly cut wood. The kilns burned for days. The smoke would have been visible for miles, and when the plaster was applied and dried to its brilliant white finish, the result was genuinely spectacular, a city that shone in the tropical sunlight visible across the flat lowland landscape like a beacon. The visual effect was not incidental. It was the point. A gleaming white city was a statement of power, wealth, and divine favour. It announced to rival kingdoms and to the gods themselves that this king, this Ajor, commanded the resources and the labour to remake the land in sacred form. The competitive logic driving this construction is something scholars sometimes describe as an architectural arms race, and the term, while modern, captures something real about the dynamic. The political world of the classic Maya was not centrally governed. It was a network of autonomous kingdoms locked in constant competition for prestige territory and the loyalty of subordinate lords. Military victory was one avenue to dominance, but architecture was another, perhaps equally important. A king who raised a towering new temple demonstrated his ability to mobilize labour, his access to surplus resources, and his piety toward the gods. A king who could not build or whose buildings were modest compared to his rivals risked appearing a weak, spiritually diminished, unworthy of the divine mandate on which his authority depended. The result was a ratchet effect. Each generation of construction raised the baseline of expectation. Temples grew taller, plazas grew wider, palaces became more elaborate, and the forests shrank. The evidence for this deforestation is not speculative. It is recorded in the sediment at the bottom of the region's lakes, preserved with a clarity that allows scientists to reconstruct the environmental history of the lowlands century by century. When researchers drill cores from these lake beds and analyse the ancient pollen trapped in each layer, the story the sediment tells is consistent and stark. In the layers corresponding to the early Classic period, the 3rd, 4th and 5th centuries AD tree pollen is abundant, indicating dense forest cover. As the layers move upward in time toward the 7th and 8th centuries, tree pollen declines sharply and is replaced by a surge in the pollen of grasses and weeds, the signature plants of open, cleared or degraded land. At the same time, the sediment layers themselves thicken with eroded soil. Fine particles of topsoil wash down from surrounding hillsides that had lost their tree cover and could no longer hold the earth in place during the intense seasonal rains. The lakes in effect became repositories for the landscape's memory, catching and preserving what the hills were losing. The consequences of this deforestation would have cascaded through the ecosystem in ways both visible and subtle. The loss of tree cover meant the loss of the root networks that anchored the thin, tropical topsoil. Without those roots, each rainy season carried more soil into the rivers and bayous, the seasonal swamps that dotted the lowland landscapes silting them up and reducing their capacity to hold water. The cleared land, exposed to the full force of the tropical sun, would have dried more quickly and retained less moisture, potentially altering local rainfall patterns, in ways that recent climate modelling suggests were not trivial. Deforestation, on a sufficient scale, can reduce evapotranspiration, the process by which trees release moisture into the atmosphere, enough to measurably decrease local precipitation. Whether the Maya deforestation reached this threshold remains debated, but the possibility is no longer dismissed. The forest, in other words, was not merely a resource the Maya were using up. It was an active participant in the hydrological cycle that sustained their agriculture. Each acre cleared for maize or burned for a plaster may have subtly reduced the reliability of the very rains the maize depended on. By the mid-8th century, the landscape surrounding the great southern cities had been fundamentally altered. Where dense forest had once stood, satellite surveys and pollen records suggest a patchwork of cultivated fields, secondary growth, and bare, eroded hillsides. The brilliant white cities still gleamed, but the green world that had sustained them was thinning. The Maya had not yet reached the point of crisis. The reservoirs still held water. The harvest still came, but they had narrowed their margin of resilience to a degree that left almost no room for an external shock. The system required the rains to arrive on schedule every year without significant variation. It required the soil to hold the fields, to produce the trade routes to remain open. Any disruption to these conditions would now be felt more acutely, more quickly, and with fewer options for recovery than at any previous point in the civilization's long history. Whether such a disruption was already beginning, or whether it arrived from outside the system entirely, is a question the stones alone cannot answer. For that, we need to look at what was happening between the kingdoms at the wars that were no longer following the old rules. The wars that change shape. How does a civilization's relationship with violence change when the resources that sustain it begin to contract? The classic Maya were never a peaceful people, despite the romantic image that persisted for much of the 20th century under Thompson's influence. Warfare was woven into the fabric of their political life from the beginning, recorded on painted ceramics carved into lintels celebrated on the great stelae that marked the reigns of kings. But for most of the classic period, the evidence suggests that this warfare operated within a set of understood conventions, a grammar of conflict that was brutal in its particulars, but limited in its strategic aims. The primary objective was not the conquest of territory or the destruction of enemy cities. It was the capture of high-ranking individuals, particularly rival kings and nobles, who would be brought back to the victor's capital for public ritual. There they would be displayed humiliated and ultimately sacrificed in ceremonies that served simultaneously as religious obligation and political theatre. The captured lord's suffering and death fed the gods, validated the victorious king's divine mandate, and sent a message of dominance to every watching vassal and rival. It was warfare as performance inseparable from the ceremonial life of the court, and for centuries it appears to have functioned as a relatively stable mechanism for managing competition between the city-states without destroying the system itself. The archaeological and epigraphic record of the late 8th and 9th centuries tells a different story. The shift is visible first in the art. At sites across the southern lowlands, the carved and painted depictions of warfare begin to change in character. The earlier images tend to follow a formula: a single, victorious king, often shown in profile, standing over or grasping the hair of a single defeated captive. The compositions are formal, almost heraldic, emphasizing the ritual dignity of the act. By the late Classic period, these composed scenes give way to something rawer. The murals at Bonampak, painted around 790 AD in a small three-room temple, are perhaps the most vivid surviving example. They depict a full battle scene, warriors in jaguar pelts and feathered headdresses clashing in chaotic close combat spears and clubs swinging, bodies falling. A subsequent panel shows the aftermath: rows of captives stripped and bleeding. One figure's fingernails visibly torn out, a severed head resting on a bed of leaves. The scale and intensity of the violence depicted at Bonampak exceeds anything from the earlier Classic record. Whether the murals represent a single exceptional event or a broader trend is debated, but they are not alone. Across the southern lowlands, the iconography of the final century skews toward larger engagements, more numerous captives, and a tone that feels less ceremonial and more desperate. The ground-level evidence supports what the art suggests. At Tikal, one of the two great superpowers of the classic Maya world, archaeologists have found the remains of defensive earthworks, ditches, and walls extending for kilometers around the city's periphery. These are not the carefully planned fortifications of a militarized society. They appear to have been constructed hastily, without the architectural refinement that characterizes Tikal's ceremonial structures. Walls of rough undressed stone, shallow dry moats, wooden palisades whose post holes survive in the soil. The impression is of a city that had not previously needed to defend its perimeter in this way, and was improvising under pressure. Similar fortifications have been identified at other late Classic sites, including Dos Pilas and the hilltop refuge of Aguatera in the Petex Batun region of Guatemala, where the evidence of the collapse's final stages is particularly stark. The Petex Batun region offers something close to a case study in how the escalation of warfare could destroy a local political system within a few generations. In the mid-7th century, a junior branch of Tikal's royal dynasty established itself at the site of Dos Pilas, apparently as part of a strategy to project Tikal's influence into the region. The Dos Pilas kings proved aggressive and effective, waging a series of wars that brought neighbouring cities under their control and created a small but powerful regional kingdom. For a time, the strategy appeared successful, but the aggressive posture provoked retaliation and resistance. By the early 8th century, the Petex Batun region had descended into a cycle of escalating conflict that consumed its political structure entirely. The capital was abandoned. The court relocated to the more defensible hilltop site of Aguateca, and then, around 800 AD, Aguateca itself was overrun. The archaeological evidence of its final hours is remarkable in its specificity. Ceramic vessels left on floors, grinding stones abandoned beside half-processed maize, personal ornaments scattered as if dropped in flight. The inhabitants did not pack up and leave in an orderly withdrawal. They fled, leaving behind the material texture of daily life in a way that preserved almost accidentally a snapshot of a community in the act of dissolution. What happened at Aguateca was local, but the pattern it illustrates, escalation, fragmentation, abandonment, echoes across the broader southern lowlands in the decades that followed. The question that the warfare evidence alone cannot fully answer is whether the escalation was a cause of the collapse or a symptom of pressures that originated elsewhere. Warfare between Maya city-states had existed for centuries without producing systemic breakdown. Something changed in the late 8th century that made the old conventions insufficient, that pushed the conflicts beyond their traditional limits into a more destructive and destabilizing form. The most frequently proposed candidate for that something is not political or military at all. It is environmental, a shift in the one variable that the Maya's entire agricultural and spiritual system depended upon but could not control. The evidence for that shift is preserved not in the stones of the cities, but in the quiet darkness beneath the earth, in places where water has been writing its own record for thousands of years. The record beneath the stone. In 1996, a team of paleoclimatologists lowered a hollow steel tube into the bed of Lake Chichancanab on the Yucatan Peninsula. The lake sits in a shallow limestone depression fed by groundwater and seasonal rain, and its sediments have been accumulating undisturbed for thousands of years. When the core was extracted, a cylinder of compacted mud roughly 6 meters long, it contained layer by layer a chemical diary of the region's rainfall stretching back across millennia. The principle is straightforward. In wet years, the lake holds more water and certain minerals remain dissolved. In dry years, the water level drops. Evaporation concentrates the dissolved minerals, and gypsum calcium sulfate precipitates out and settles to the bottom. A gypsum-rich layer means drought. A gypsum-poor layer means rain. The researchers did not need to interpret symbolic art or debate the meaning of a glyph. The chemistry was direct, measurable, and indifferent to human narrative. And what it showed when the core was sectioned and analysed was striking. The layers corresponding to the period between roughly 750 and 900 AD, precisely the window of the classic Maya collapse in the southern lowlands, contained the highest concentrations of gypsum in the entire record. The region had experienced its most severe and sustained drought in nearly 2,000 years, and it had arrived at exactly the moment the cities began to fall silent. A single lake core, however compelling, is not proof. Sediment records can be influenced by local conditions, changes in groundwater, flow shifts in vegetation around the lakeshore, disturbances from storms or human activity. The finding needed independent confirmation, and it came from an entirely different kind of archive. Deep beneath the limestone surface of the Yucatan, the peninsula's vast underground cave systems hold formations that have been growing imperceptibly for millennia. Stalagmites, the columnar structures that rise from cave floors where mineral-laden water drips from the ceiling, grow in microscopic layers, each one deposited over months or years. Like tree rings, these layers can be counted and dated. But they also contain a chemical signature that is for climate scientists extraordinarily useful. The ratio of two oxygen isotopes, oxygen-16 and oxygen-18 in each layer, varies depending on the amount of rainfall at the time the layer was deposited. Drier conditions produce a heavier isotopic signature. Wetter conditions produce a lighter one. By drilling into a stalagmite and analysing the isotope ratios layer by layer, researchers can reconstruct rainfall patterns with a resolution that approaches, in some cases, near monthly precision. When the stalagmite records from caves across the Yucatan and northern Guatemala were compiled and cross-referenced with the lake sediment data, the two independent archives told the same story. The classic Maya heartland had enjoyed an unusually favourable period of reliable, above-average rainfall from roughly 300 to 660 AD, a span that corresponds almost exactly to the centuries of the civilization's greatest growth and monument building. Then, beginning in the mid to late 7th century, and intensifying sharply after 750 AD, the climate shifted. Rainfall declined. The decline was not steady or uniform. It came in pulses with periods of partial recovery, followed by renewed and deepening drought. The most severe episodes, sometimes described as mega-droughts, appear to have lasted decades at a stretch separated by intervals too brief for a stressed agricultural system to fully recover. The convergence of these two records, one from lake chemistry, one from cave mineralogy derived from entirely different physical processes, is the kind of independent corroboration that moves a hypothesis from suggestive to difficult to dismiss. The implications for the Maya cities are not difficult to imagine, though imagination should be tempered by what the archaeological record actually shows. The southern lowlands relied on seasonal rainfall, not only for agriculture but for drinking water. Unlike the northern Yucatan, where natural sinkholes called cenotes provided access to the underground water table, the southern cities depended on massive artificial reservoirs, carefully engineered catchment systems that collected and stored rainwater during the wet season for use during the dry months. Tikal's reservoir system, the largest and most studied, could hold tens of thousands of cubic meters of water when full. These reservoirs were civic infrastructure on a monumental scale, and their capacity was calibrated to the historical norms of rainfall the city had experienced over centuries. A prolonged reduction in that rainfall, the kind the sediment and stalagmite records describe, would have slowly, mercilessly reduced the reservoir's ability to carry the city through each dry season. The reserves that had always been sufficient would have begun to fall short. The buffer between enough and not enough would have thinned each year until in the worst drought episodes it disappeared entirely. Maize, the crop on which everything depended, is particularly sensitive to water stress during its tasseling and grain-filling stages. A shortfall of rain at the wrong moment in the growing cycle can reduce yields catastrophically, even if total annual rainfall is only modestly below average. For a population already farming at the limits of the land's capacity, already dependent on every harvest meeting, expectations, even a partial crop failure in consecutive years, would have been devastating. Granaries would have emptied. Stored surplus, if it existed, would have been consumed. The caloric margin that separated a functioning society from a hungry one was by the late 8th century almost certainly thinner than it had been at any point in the civilization's history. And the droughts were not partial. They were, according to the paleoclimate evidence, among the worst the region had seen in recorded geological time. What remains genuinely debated, and what the climate data alone cannot resolve, is the precise relationship between drought and political collapse. Correlation, even striking correlation, is not the same as causation. The droughts were real. The collapse was real. They coincided. But whether the drought drove the collapse directly, or whether it acted as a catalyst on a system already weakened by other forces, deforestation, soil depletion, political fragmentation, escalating warfare, is a question whose answer depends on which evidence you weight most heavily, and how you interpret the silences in the record. That interpretive tension is something we should sit with rather than resolve too quickly, because it leads us to a chapter where the comfortable certainties of narrative begin to thin, and the honest uncertainties of the evidence come into sharper focus. The things that don't quite fit. Before we go further, it is worth pausing to acknowledge something that tidy narratives tend to smooth over. The story, as we have followed it so far, deforestation, weakening the land, drought, delivering the blow, warfare accelerating the spiral, has a satisfying internal logic. Each element connects to the next. Each cause feeds the consequence that follows. It is in many ways an elegant explanation, and that elegance should give us a moment's hesitation. History, particularly the history of complex societies over long periods, is rarely as coherent as the stories we tell about it. The evidence for the classic Maya collapse is real and substantial, but it is also incomplete, unevenly distributed across the landscape, and open to interpretations that do not always converge as neatly as a single narrative might suggest. If we are to take the evidence seriously, we should take its contradictions seriously as well. The first and perhaps most obvious difficulty is the geographical unevenness of the collapse itself. The perfect storm model, drought plus deforestation plus warfare, describes events in the southern lowlands with considerable force. But the Maya world did not end at the borders of the Petén rainforest. To the north, on the drier, flatter limestone platform of the Yucatan Peninsula, Maya cities were not only surviving during the 9th century but actively flourishing. Chichen Itza, Uxmal and Kabar were entering periods of major construction and political expansion at precisely the time Tikal and Calakmul were falling silent. If catastrophic drought was the primary driver of collapse, this presents an uncomfortable problem. The northern Yucatan is by every modern measure a drier environment than the southern lowlands. It receives less annual rainfall, its soils are thinner, it has no rivers to speak of, and yet the cities there thrived while the wetter, more fertile south disintegrated. Some scholars have argued that the northern cities adapted differently, that they relied more heavily on cenotes, the natural sinkholes that access the underground water table, making them less vulnerable to fluctuations in surface rainfall. Others point to the robust maritime trade networks that connected northern coastal cities, providing an economic resilience that the landlocked southern kingdoms lacked. These explanations are plausible, but they complicate the drought hypothesis in ways that have not been fully resolved. If the same climatic event produced collapse in one region and a golden age in another, then climate alone cannot be a sufficient explanation. Something else, something about the specific vulnerabilities of the southern system, must have mattered as much or more. The second difficulty concerns the precision of the correlation between drought and political failure. The paleoclimate data from lake cores and stalagmites is genuinely impressive in its resolution, and the broad overlap between the onset of drought around 750 AD and the cessation of monument building across the southern lowlands is hard to ignore. But when you look more closely at the timing, the fit becomes less exact. Some cities, Dos Pilas and Aguateca in the Petex Batoon region for instance, were already in severe crisis by the mid-8th century, arguably before the worst drought episodes identified in the climate record. Others like Tikal continued to erect monuments into the 860s, persisting for over a century after the drought is thought to have begun. If drought were operating as a straightforward direct cause, we might expect the cities to fail in a more synchronized pattern, with the most water-stressed sites collapsing first and the better provisioned ones holding out longer. Instead, the pattern of abandonment is staggered irregular and seems to follow political and military fault lines as much as environmental ones. The correlation is real, but it is loose enough to leave room for significant doubt about the mechanism by which climate translated into political collapse. A third complication, less frequently discussed but worth noting, involves the question of population. The narrative of the collapse assumes, reasonably, given the archaeological evidence, that the southern lowlands experienced a dramatic depopulation over the course of the 9th and 10th centuries. The cities emptied, the countryside thinned. But estimating ancient Maya population with any confidence is notoriously difficult. The figures most commonly cited, 60,000 for Tikal, several million for the southern lowlands as a whole, are derived from surveys of residential mound density extrapolated across the landscape, using assumptions about household size and occupation rates. Recent LiDAR surveys, which use airborne laser scanning to map structures hidden beneath the jungle canopy, have revealed far more buildings than were previously known, suggesting that earlier population estimates may have been too low. But more buildings do not automatically mean more people or simultaneous occupation, or the specific population densities that the overshoot and collapse model requires. The numbers matter because the severity of the environmental crisis, how much forest was cut, how much soil was lost, how close to carrying capacity the population actually was, depends on getting the population roughly right. And roughly right may be the best we can do. None of this means the drought hypothesis is wrong, or that deforestation and warfare were not significant factors. It means that the confidence with which these elements are sometimes assembled into a single seamless narrative may outrun the evidence. The classic Maya collapse was not one event. It was a process that unfolded differently in different places over more than a century. The causes that mattered most in the Petex Batoon may not have been the same causes that mattered most at Tikal or Calakmul. The relative weight of climate ecology, politics and warfare likely varied from kingdom to kingdom, decade to decade, in ways the surviving evidence can only partially reconstruct. What we are left with is not a solved case, but a pattern, a convergence of pressures whose individual contributions cannot be cleanly separated. It may be that the most honest reading of the evidence is not a story with a clear sequence of causes and effects, but something more like a portrait of a system under compound stress, where no single factor was sufficient on its own, but the combination proved more than the system could absorb. That uncertainty is not a weakness of the evidence. It may be the most important thing the evidence has to say. And it is worth carrying with us as we return now to the cities themselves, to the people who lived through the unraveling, and to the question of what the final years actually looked like from the inside. The unfinished rooms. We left the evidence in a state of honest uncertainty, a convergence of pressures whose individual weights resist precise measurement. But there is another kind of evidence that does not deal in chemical signatures or pollen ratios. It deals in things people made and things people left behind, and it tells its story not through data, but through absence. Across the southern lowlands, in the archaeological layers corresponding to the final decades of the Classic period, there is a recurring pattern that is difficult to interpret as anything other than a society in the process of coming apart. It is not dramatic. It is not sudden. It is the quiet accumulation of incompleteness, projects started and never finished, traditions maintained in diminished form, and then abandoned altogether, spaces built for ceremony, repurposed for survival. The stones of the Maya cities, which had spoken so eloquently for centuries through their carvings and their architecture, begin in this final phase to speak through what was not done. At Tikal, the evidence is particularly striking. In the ceremonial core of the city, archaeologists have documented construction projects that were clearly initiated on a grand-scale new temple, platforms expansions to existing palace complexes, broad ceremonial causeways, and then abandoned before completion. Carved stone blocks sit where they were left, some along the roadways leading to construction sites, others stacked at the edges of half-paved plazas. The plaster floors of partially completed rooms show no signs of use. The walls rise to an arbitrary height and simply stop with no evidence of roofing or finishing. These are not buildings that were destroyed by an enemy. They are buildings that were never finished by the people who started them. The labour and resources that had been reliably channeled into monumental construction for centuries, the great engine of tribute and corvée that had built the white cities, had at some point in the late 8th or early 9th century ceased to function. The workers who had carved and hauled and plastered simply did not come, or could not be compelled to come, or were needed elsewhere for more pressing tasks. The silence of the unfinished rooms is different from the silence of the final stelae. It speaks not to the end of royal authority's symbolic expression, but to the failure of its practical machinery. The transformation of the city's physical character in these final decades tells a parallel story. The classic Maya ceremonial centre was by design an open space. The great plazas were built for gathering, for the performance of rituals witnessed by thousands, for the public display of captives, for the markets and festivals that punctuated the agricultural calendar. The architecture expressed confidence. Wide staircases invited approach. Temple doorways faced outward toward the assembled populace. The relationship between ruler and ruled was enacted in shared space under open sky. In the final phase, this openness contracts. At multiple sites, archaeologists have found evidence of hastily constructed walls and barriers erected across formerly open plazas and causeways. At Tikal, rough stone walls were built to restrict access to the central precincts. At Dos Pilas, the population dismantled carved monuments and reused the stone to build defensive barricades, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier, the equivalent of tearing pages from a sacred text to patch a wall. The cities were turning inward, sealing themselves off, converting spaces designed for ceremony into spaces designed for defense. The physical transformation is a mirror of the political one. The divine king, who had once stood atop his pyramid, visible to thousands performing the rituals that sustain the cosmos, was now sheltering behind improvised fortifications, his authority reduced to whatever territory his walls could enclose. The quality of material culture in these final layers also shows a measurable decline. The painted ceramics of the High Classic period, elaborate polychrome vessels depicting mythological scenes, court life and ritual, are among the finest achievements of Maya artisanship, executed with a technical skill and an artistic sophistication that reflect generations of accumulated tradition. In the terminal classic layers, the ceramics become simpler. The polychrome painting grows less refined. The forms become more utilitarian. At some sites, the latest ceramics are undecorated, entirely coarse vessels made for cooking and storage rather than display. The trajectory suggests not a sudden rupture, but a gradual loss of the specialized artisans who produced the finest work of the trade networks that supplied the pigments and materials of the courtly demand that had sustained the tradition, and ultimately of the surplus wealth that made luxury production possible at all. A society that had once invested enormous creative energy in the beauty of its objects was redirecting what remained of its resources towards simpler, more immediate needs. Perhaps the most revealing evidence of the city's final transformation comes from the way their spaces were reused after the elite inhabitants departed. At several sites, including Copan and Tikal, excavations have shown that after the royal court ceased to function, commoner populations moved into the abandoned ceremonial and palatial structures. Cooking fires were lit on the polished plaster floors of rooms that had once housed kings. Crude domestic structures were built in the courtyards of temples. Storage pits were dug into the surfaces of grand plazas. The people who did this were not invaders or squatters in the hostile sense. They were in all likelihood the same population that had always lived in the city's periphery, farmers, labourers, artisans, now occupying the hollow centre of a system that no longer functioned. There is something quietly devastating about this image. The sacred spaces that had been the symbolic heart of the Maya cosmos, where kings communed with gods, and the order of the universe was ritually maintained, had become in their final use ordinary domestic space. Cook fires, where once there had been visioned serpents. The transition was not violent. It was simply the last stage of a process in which meaning drained from the structures that had once contained it. But even this diminished occupation did not last. The cooking fires went cold, the crude shelters were abandoned in turn, and the question of where the people went, not the kings whose fate is recorded in the cessation of the stelae, but the tens of thousands of ordinary Maya who had sustained the cities with their labour and their corn, leads us away from the ceremonial centres and out into the surrounding landscape where a different kind of evidence awaits. The exodus no one declared among the artefacts recovered from the final occupation layers at Aguateca. There is a set of ceramic grinding stones, manos and metates, found resting beside a scatter of partially processed maize kernels on the floor of a domestic structure. The maize had been shelled from the cob but not yet ground into the dough that was the basis of virtually every Maya meal. Whoever was working at that grinding stone stepped away from a task so routine, so deeply embedded in the rhythm of daily life, that its interruption speaks more clearly than any carved monument to the extremity of the moment. You do not abandon half-ground corn unless you are leaving in a way that does not allow for return. The grinding stones at Aguateca are a small thing, but they carry an enormous weight, the weight of a departure that was not planned, not orderly, and not expected to be temporary. And Aguateca, as we've seen, was not unique. Across the southern lowlands, the archaeological signature of the 9th and 10th centuries is one of progressive, irreversible abandonment. The question is not whether the people left. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is how we should understand the leaving as flight, as migration, as a collective decision, or as something that has no single adequate name. The common narrative frames the Maya collapse as a catastrophe that happened to people, drought struck, wars raged, the system failed, and the population suffered the consequences. There is truth in this framing, but it obscures something important. The abandonment of the great cities was not purely a passive response to external disaster. It was in many cases an active choice, perhaps the most rational choice available under the circumstances. The Maya of the southern lowlands were not a population trapped in their cities by walls or ideology. They were and had always been a people whose deeper relationship was with the land rather than with the urban centres. The great cities were the seats of royal and religious authority, the places where tribute was collected and ritual performed, but the majority of the population lived in dispersed agricultural settlements surrounding the ceremonial cores. Their survival depended not on the city itself, but on their ability to grow maize, and when the conditions for growing maize in the immediate vicinity of the great cities deteriorated through soil exhaustion, deforestation, drought, or the disruption caused by constant warfare, the logic of remaining near the urban centre weakened with each failed harvest. Leaving was not collapse, it was adaptation. It was a reversion to an older, more dispersed and in many ways more sustainable pattern of settlement that did not require the enormous surplus extraction of divine kingship to function. The pattern of this dispersal, insofar as it can be reconstructed, was not a single mass exodus, but a slow generational bleeding of population from the urban cores into the hinterlands and beyond. Some communities appear to have moved relatively short distances, resettling along rivers, or near more reliable water sources in the surrounding countryside. Others moved farther toward the coast, toward the northern Yucatan, toward the highland regions of what is now Guatemala and Chiapas. The archaeological evidence for these movements is by its nature harder to detect than the evidence of urban occupation. Dispersed farming communities leave lighter traces in the landscape than monumental cities' smaller middens, fewer durable structures, less decorated pottery. But the traces exist. In the centuries following the classic collapse, the settlement pattern of the southern lowlands shifts decisively away from nucleated urban centres and towards smaller scattered communities along waterways and lake margins. The population did not vanish. It redistributed, settling into a pattern that demanded less from the environment and less from the social structures that had organised Maya life for 6 centuries. What did not survive the transition, or at least did not survive in recognisable form, was the institution that had defined the classic Maya political world divine kingship itself. The Kahula Jaf, the Holy Lord whose sacred blood had sustained the cosmic order, whose authority had justified the extraction of tribute and labour from tens of thousands of commoners whose rituals had promised rain and harvest, and the continuation of the world, this figure simply disappears from the record. No final stelae announce the end of the institution. No inscriptions describe a decision to abandon the old ways. The tradition of erecting carved monuments to royal authority simply ceases city by city, across the southern lowlands over the course of roughly a century and a half. The last dated monument at Tonina in the western reaches of the Maya lowlands corresponds to the year 909 AD. After that date, no classic Maya king in the southern region is known to have commissioned a public record of his reign. The silence is total, and as far as the current evidence shows, permanent. Whatever replaced divine kingship in the communities that survived councils of elders, local headmen, lineage-based authority structures left no comparable monumental record, and our understanding of the post-classic political organisation of the southern lowlands remains accordingly thin. The dissolution of divine kingship was not merely a political event, it was the collapse of a cosmological system, a way of understanding the relationship between human action and the behaviour of the natural world that had structured Maya thought and society for centuries. The king's rituals had been the mechanism through which the human community maintained its covenant with the divine. Rain harvest, cosmic order all flowed through the body of the king, through his blood, through the smoke of the burning offerings. When the rains failed and the king's rituals could not restore them, the failure was not just practical but theological. The entire explanatory framework, the reason the king existed, the reason tribute was paid, the reason the pyramids were built lost its persuasive force. The people did not merely lose confidence in a particular king, they lost confidence in kingship as a concept, in the idea that any human intermediary could guarantee the behaviour of the sky. That loss of faith, quiet and undramatic as it may have been in any individual community, was arguably the deepest rupture of the collapse, deeper than the wars, deeper than the droughts, because it dissolved the meaning that had held the entire system together. And yet the people who walked away from the silent pyramids did not walk into oblivion. They carried with them their languages, their agricultural knowledge, their weaving traditions, their understanding of the stars. The civilization of the divine kings ended. The culture of the Maya people did not. What happened in the north, where a different model of Maya civilization was taking shape, even as the south was emptying, suggests that the story of resilience may be as important as the story of collapse, and considerably less often told. The northern flowering. Twice a year, on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the late afternoon sun strikes the northwestern balustrade of the pyramid known as El Castillo at Chichen Itza, and produces a pattern of triangular shadows that descend the staircase in a slow, undulating sequence, joining a carved serpent head at the base to create the illusion of a feathered snake crawling down from the temple toward the earth. The effect lasts roughly 45 minutes. It requires no mechanism, no operator, no maintenance. It is built into the geometry of the structure itself, an alignment of angle, orientation, and solar position calculated with such precision that it has repeated without failure for over 1,000 years. Whether the effect was intentionally designed or is a fortunate coincidence of the building's proportions remains debated among archaeologists, but the fact that it exists at all speaks to something essential about the civilization that built it. This was a culture still capable of extraordinary intellectual and architectural achievements, still deeply engaged with the movements of the cosmos, still building on a monumental scale. And it was doing so at the very moment the great cities of the southern lowlands were being reclaimed by the forest. The survival and flourishing of the northern Maya cities during and after the southern collapse is one of the most important and most frequently underemphasized aspects of the story. It complicates the narrative of civilizational failure in ways that are worth sitting with. If the classic Maya collapse was simply a story of a civilization that overreached and was destroyed by its own excess, the northern cities should not exist, or at least they should not have thrived precisely when the south was dying, and yet they did. Chichen Itza, Oxmal, Kaba, Sayil, Labne. These cities entered their most productive and ambitious building phases in the 9th and 10th centuries, constructing some of the most recognizable monuments in the entire Maya architectural tradition, during a period that is conventionally described as one of collapse. The terminal classic and early post-classic in the northern Yucatan were not ages of decline, they were ages of reinvention. The differences between the northern and southern Maya systems are instructive, though they should not be overstated. The northern Yucatan is environmentally a harsher landscape than the southern lowlands. The soil is thinner, the rainfall is lower, there are no surface rivers, the terrain is flat, low limestone covered by scrubby secondary forest rather than the tall, dense canopy of the Patean. On paper, it seems like a less promising setting for a complex civilization than the south. But the north possessed one critical resource the south largely lacked: cenotes. These natural sinkholes formed by the collapse of the limestone surface into the underground water table provided direct access to a reliable freshwater source that was not dependent on seasonal rainfall. A city built near a cenote had a permanent water supply that no drought could entirely eliminate. Chichen Itza's very name reflects this advantage. It translates roughly as at the mouth of the well of the Itzar, a direct acknowledgement that the city's identity was inseparable from its water source. These cenotes did not make the northern cities immune to drought, but they provided a buffer that the reservoir-dependent southern cities did not possess. The economic foundations of the northern cities also differed from those of the south in ways that may have been equally important. While the southern kingdoms had relied primarily on intensive agriculture and overland trade, the northern cities developed a robust maritime commerce that connected them to distant markets around the entire Yucatan coast and beyond. Large seafaring canoes, dugouts capable of carrying several tons of cargo, and crews of dozens moved goods along the coastline and across open water. Salt harvested from the extensive coastal salt flats of the northern Yucatan was among the most valuable commodities in the Mesoamerican world, essential for food preservation and widely traded. Honey-cotton textiles, beeswax, and cacao moved through the same networks. Obsidian and jade, which had to be imported from highland sources, flowed in the opposite direction. This maritime trade network gave the northern cities an economic resilience that was fundamentally different from the agricultural surplus model of the south. A city whose wealth derived from controlling a trade route or a salt flat was less immediately vulnerable to a bad harvest than a city whose wealth derived from the annual maize crop. The diversification was not complete. The northern Maya still farmed, still depended on maize, but the additional economic layer provided a margin of survival that the south had lacked. The political structures of the northern cities also appear to have evolved in directions that moved away from the strict divine kingship model of the classic south. The evidence here is less certain because the northern Maya left fewer detailed historical inscriptions than their southern predecessors, and the political terminology that does appear in the surviving texts is more ambiguous. But the architectural and iconographic evidence suggests a shift toward more collective or council-based governance at some northern sites. At Chichen Itza, for instance, the art and architecture emphasize warriors, merchant figures, and council scenes, rather than the single, omnipotent, divine king who dominates southern classic imagery. The Temple of the Warriors, with its forest of carved columns depicting individual armed figures, presents a vision of power that is distributed, rather than concentrated an army of notables rather than a solitary lord communing with the gods. Whether this reflects a genuine constitutional change or merely a different mode of royal self-presentation is debated, but the visual contrast with the southern stelae tradition is striking. If the southern collapse was partly a crisis of divine kingship, a failure of the theological claim on which royal authority rested, then the northern cities may have survived in part because they had developed, or were developing political structures that did not rest so entirely on a single sacred promise. Yet even the northern flowering was not permanent. Chichen Itza itself experienced a decline in the 11th century, its political dominance passing to the city of Mayapan, which in turn collapsed in the 15th century amid internal conflict. The pattern of rise, flourishing, and eventual decline repeated itself, though, on different timescales and under different pressures. The northern survival does not invalidate the story of the southern collapse. Rather, it places it in a broader context, one in which collapse is not the defining event of Maya history, but one chapter in a much longer narrative of adaptation, reorganization, and continuity. The Maya did not end, they changed. And the forms that change took in the south, and in the north, in the cities and in the countryside before and after the Spanish arrival, carry their own weight and their own lessons. Some of those lessons are written not in the archaeological record, but in the living memory of the people who carry the Maya inheritance today in languages and traditions and ways of understanding the land that have survived longer than any pyramid. That continuity is where we turn next. The people who did not vanish. What does it mean for a civilization to survive its own collapse? The phrase itself contains a contradiction that is worth examining, because how we answer it determines whether the story of the classic Maya ends in the 9th century or continues into the present. The Western archaeological tradition has, for understandable reasons, tended to focus on the monumental, on the pyramids, the stelae, the carved lintels, the elaborate tombs. These are the things that survive in the ground. They are measurable, datable, photographable. They fill museum cases and documentary films, but they represent the output of a very specific social system, divine kingship, tribute extraction, elite ritual. And when that system ended, the material record it produced ended with it. The temptation reinforced by centuries of colonial narrative is to equate the end of the monuments with the end of the people. The cities fell silent, so the civilization must have died. The Maya in this framing become a lost civilization past tense, completed, available for romantic rediscovery but not for ongoing conversation. The problem with this framing is that it is wrong. Not partially wrong, not wrong in emphasis, but factually demonstrably incorrect. The Maya are not lost, they are here. More than 7 million people of Maya descent live today in the same lands their ancestors inhabited in the highlands and lowlands of Guatemala, in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, in Belize, in western Honduras, in pockets of El Salvador. They are not a remnant population clinging to the margins. They are in Guatemala, a demographic majority. They speak more than 30 distinct Mayan languages, several of which, Quiché, Yucatec, Quechua, Mam, have hundreds of thousands or even millions of speakers. These are not museum languages preserved by a handful of elderly speakers in isolated villages. They are living, evolving tongues used in markets, in homes, in schools, in political discourse, in literature. The linguistic continuity alone is remarkable. A Quiché speaker today uses a language whose roots extend back thousands of years, a language that is structurally related to the one the classic period scribes used when they carved their histories into stone. The words have changed, as all words do over millennia, but the grammatical architecture and many of the core concepts remain recognizable to linguists who study both the ancient inscriptions and the modern spoken forms. The cultural continuities extend far beyond language. In the highland communities of Guatemala, particularly among the Quiché and Cachical Maya women, still weave textiles on backstrap looms, using techniques that have been practiced for centuries. The patterns woven into these textiles the huipilís worn, as everyday and ceremonial garments, are not merely decorative. They encode community identity, spiritual meaning and cosmological knowledge in arrangements of colour and form that vary from village to village and carry specific significance understood by their makers. A single huipil can take months to complete. The knowledge required to produce one, the selection and preparation of thread, the setting of the warp, the execution of complex pattern sequences from memory, represents an unbroken transmission of skill and meaning across generations. The loom itself, a deceptively simple apparatus of sticks and cord, is functionally identical to looms, depicted in classic period ceramic paintings over 1,000 years old. The technology persisted because it worked, and because the knowledge it carried was considered worth preserving. In the villages of the Yucatan, and in the more remote highland communities of Guatemala, religious practice reflects a similar depth of continuity. The Spanish conquest of the 16th century imposed Catholicism with varying degrees of force and success across the Maya world, but in many communities the result was not replacement, but synthesis, a layered religious practice in which Catholic saints and ceremonies coexist with and are often understood through older Maya cosmological frameworks. Agricultural rituals tied to the planting and harvesting of maize persist in forms that would be recognizable in their essential structure to a classic period farmer. Ceremonies are performed to ask permission of the earth before planting. Offerings are made to ensure rain. The 4 cardinal directions retain their sacred associations. The relationship between human beings, the corn and the forces that govern the natural world, the same triangular relationship that defined classic Maya cosmology, remains in these communities a living framework for understanding existence, rather than a historical curiosity studied from the outside. The forms have changed. The Catholic overlay is real and should not be dismissed as superficial. But the underlying structure, the sense that human survival depends on a reciprocal relationship with the land and the forces that animate it, has shown a persistence that is extraordinary by any measure. The survival of the Maya as a people and a culture is not a footnote to the collapse. It may be the most important part of the story because it reframes everything that came before. The classic Maya collapse was not the death of a civilization. It was the end of a particular political and economic system, one based on divine kingship, monumental construction, intensive surplus extraction, and the concentration of population in large urban centres. That system failed catastrophically under the compound pressures of environmental degradation, climate change, and escalating conflict. But the culture that had existed before and alongside that system, the languages, the agricultural knowledge, the textile traditions, the cosmological understanding, the fundamental relationship with the maize and the land proved more durable than the pyramids. The people who walked away from the silent cities did not walk into cultural oblivion. They carried their inheritance with them, adapted it to new circumstances, and transmitted it to their children, who transmitted it to theirs across a chain of generations that remains unbroken today. This distinction between the collapse of a system and the survival of a culture matters for reasons that extend beyond the Maya themselves. It challenges the assumption, common in both popular and academic narratives, that civilizational collapse means civilizational death. The archaeological record, focused as it necessarily is on the material traces of elite activity, tends to reinforce this assumption by falling silent when the elite system ends. But the silence of the archaeological record is not the same as the silence of the people. The record goes quiet because the behaviours that produced it, monument carving, elaborate burial palace construction, ceased. The people went on living, farming, speaking, weaving, remembering. Their story simply moved into channels that the archaeological method is less equipped to detect: oral tradition, textile arts, agricultural practice, community ritual channels that carry their own kind of evidence, their own kind of truth, even if they leave no trace in the sediment of a lake bed. That the Maya endured is not in question. How we understand their endurance, what it tells us about the relationship between a people and the systems they build between a culture and its most visible expressions, is a matter we will return to as we approach the end of this journey. But first, there is one more layer of the collapse itself that deserves attention, one that returns us to the moment of unraveling, and asks what it might have felt like, not from the vantage of science or archaeology, but from the ground, the weight of a single season. Sometime in the early 9th century, in a small residential compound on the outskirts of Copan, someone sealed a ceramic storage jar and placed it in a corner of a room that would not be opened again. The jar, when excavated centuries later, was empty. No residue of maize, no trace of beans or squash or dried chili. It had been cleaned and sealed with care, stored as if in expectation of a future use that never came. There is no inscription on it, no glyph, no painted scene. It is an ordinary domestic object, the kind of thing that would be unremarkable in any occupied household. What makes it notable is its context. It was found in a structure that shows no evidence of violent destruction, no signs of hasty flight, no scatter of possessions across the floor. The room was simply closed. The jar was simply left. The people who lived there appear to have departed in a manner that was deliberate, considered, and final, taking what they needed and leaving behind what they could not carry or no longer expected to fill. It is the quietest kind of evidence, and perhaps for that reason the most affecting. It suggests not a moment of crisis, but an accumulation of moments, a season that failed, and then another, and then a recognition arrived at slowly that the pattern was not going to reverse. We have examined the collapse from the outside through paleoclimate data, through settlement patterns, through the cessation of monumental inscriptions, and the transformation of urban spaces. These are the tools available to us, and they are powerful. But they describe the collapse as a process observed from a distance measured in centuries and chemical ratios. What they cannot easily convey is what the experience of that process might have felt like to the people who lived through it, not the kings whose stories are partially preserved in the final stelae, but the farmers, the weavers, the potters, the mothers grinding maize in the early morning darkness, the men walking to fields that produced less each year. Their experience is not recorded in any archive. It must be inferred carefully and with appropriate humility from the material traces they left behind and from what we know about the systems on which their daily lives depended, consider the centrality of the maize cycle to every dimension of Maya existence. A family's year was structured around the planting, tending and harvesting of their milpa, the small mixed crop field that provided the bulk of their calories. The timing of each stage was governed by the seasonal rains which in a normal year arrived with sufficient regularity to fill the soil with moisture before planting and to sustain the growing stalks through their critical tasseling phase. A good harvest meant security enough maize to feed the household, to meet tribute obligations to the local lord, and perhaps to set aside a small surplus against the uncertainty of the following year. A poor harvest meant hunger, but a single poor harvest could be survived. Families had networks of reciprocal obligation kin neighbours, fellow members of a lineage group that could absorb a temporary shortfall. The danger was not one bad year. The danger was consecutive bad years, each one drawing down the reserves that the previous one had failed to replenish. Each one narrowing the margin between subsistence and starvation a little further. The paleoclimate record tells us that this is precisely what happened, not a single catastrophic drought, but a series of severe dry episodes separated by partial recoveries that were insufficient to restore what had been lost. The cumulative effect experienced at the household level would have been a slow, relentless tightening, a constriction of possibility that grew worse not suddenly but by degrees. The social fabric would have frayed along the same slow gradient. The Maya commoner's relationship with the elite was transactional in a specific and concrete sense. Tribute paid in maize in labour, in woven cloth in other goods, was not simply extracted by force. It was rendered in exchange for the king's performance of his sacred duties, duties that were understood to maintain the conditions necessary for survival. When those conditions held, when the rains came and the harvest was adequate, the transaction was self-reinforcing. But when the rains failed, the transaction lost its logic. A family struggling to feed itself would have found the demand for tribute increasingly intolerable, not merely as an economic burden, but as an affront to the covenant that justified it. You gave your maize to the king so that his blood could bring the rain. The rain did not come. The maize was gone. The question of whether to continue honouring the obligation would not have required sophisticated political analysis. It would have been a matter of arithmetic, the arithmetic of a family, counting the kernels remaining in a storage jar and measuring them against the mouths that needed feeding. The erosion of faith in the divine king's efficacy would have compounded the practical crisis in ways that are difficult to disentangle. The Maya commoner did not live in a secular world where religion was one compartment among many. The sacred and the practical were fused. The king's rituals were not symbolic gestures performed for a tradition's sake. They were understood as causally effective as the mechanism by which rain was produced and cosmic order maintained. When that mechanism visibly failed year after year, the failure was not merely political, it was cosmological. The framework through which ordinary people understood their relationship to the natural world, the reason the corn grew, the reason the seasons turned, the reason suffering had meaning was undermined. We cannot know how this felt from the inside. We cannot access the specific texture of a community's loss of faith in a system that had organised every aspect of its existence for as long as anyone could remember. But we can note that the archaeological evidence of the final decades, the crude domestic fires on palace floors, the dismantled monuments reused as building stone, the steady thinning of population from the urban cores is consistent with a society in which the old structures of meaning had lost their hold quietly, without revolution or dramatic repudiation, but completely. The sealed jar in the corner of the room at Copan may be the truest artifact of the collapse, not because it tells us what happened, but because it tells us how it ended for one family. Not with fire, not with war, with a careful, quiet closing of a door. And with that image held gently in mind, we come to the last of our chapters, where we stand at the edge of what the evidence can tell us and consider what the silence itself might mean. What the silence holds. If you stand in the central plaza of Tikal at dawn before the first tourist groups arrive, the sound that fills the space is not silence at all. It is the deep resonant call of howler monkeys moving through the canopy above the temple. Peaks a sound so low and powerful it seems to rise from the stone itself. Birds call in, overlapping layers, toucans, parrots. The liquid notes of orioles threading through the heavier air beneath the trees. Insects hum at a frequency that becomes after a few minutes indistinguishable from the heat. The forest is not quiet. It is enormously insistently alive, and it has been conducting this conversation with itself across the ruins for more than 1,000 years, filling the space that human voices left behind. The great plaza, which once held thousands of people gathered for ceremony, for market, for the public rituals of divine kings, is now a clearing in the canopy where sunlight reaches the ground, and the roots of sabre and ramon trees grip the edges of carved stone platforms with the patience of centuries. The pyramids still rise above the tree-line. Temple 1 and Temple 4 are visible for miles, but their sharp limestone angles have been softened by moss, by the slow mineral work of water, by the persistent pressure of roots finding every crack and seam. The city has not been destroyed. It has been absorbed. The forest did not conquer Tikal. It simply resumed what it had been doing before the Maya cleared the land, growing over everything with the same impersonal persistence with which water fills a depression in the ground. This is the condition in which the silent cities have spent most of their existence, not as ruins, which implies a state of degradation from some original completeness, but as landscapes in transition, places where human intention and natural process have been negotiating for 1,000 years over the same pieces of ground. The Maya who built Tikal understood the forest as a living entity, with its own agency and its own claims. Their agriculture was a constant negotiation with that agency, clearing land, holding the jungle at bay, extracting what the soil could give before yielding it back. When the people left, the forest did not take revenge. It simply resumed the negotiation on its own terms, and its terms given enough time are always the same: growth, coverage, the slow burial of whatever lies beneath. There is a temptation when standing among ruins of this scale and antiquity to draw lessons to extract from the Maya collapse a moral applicable to our own time, a warning about environmental overreach or the hubris of civilizations that believe themselves permanent. The temptation is understandable. The parallels are not imaginary. A society that depleted its forests, degraded its soils, and then faced a climate shift it could not control the resonances with contemporary concerns are close enough to feel uncomfortable. But we should be cautious about the neatness of the comparison. The classic Maya operated within constraints and with knowledge systems so different from our own that direct analogy risks distorting both their story and ours. They did not have the concept of anthropogenic climate change. They did not understand deforestation in ecological terms. Their framework for interpreting environmental stress was theological, not scientific. When the rains failed, the explanation was not atmospheric but spiritual, a failure of the sacred covenant between king and gods. To project modern environmental consciousness backward onto the Maya is to misunderstand the world in which their choices were made. They were not us. Their failures were not our failures rehearsed in advance. Their story is its own, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms before it is borrowed for other purposes. What can be said with appropriate care is something more modest but perhaps more durable. The classic Maya collapse demonstrates that complex societies are not inherently stable, that the systems human beings build to organize their collective lives, no matter how sophisticated, no matter how long they endure, remain dependent on conditions they do not fully control and may not fully understand. The Maya elite believed with complete sincerity that their rituals governed the behavior of the natural world. That belief sustained a political and social system of remarkable longevity and extraordinary cultural achievement. When the natural world ceased to cooperate when the rains failed, and the sacred technology of bloodletting could not restore them, the belief did not merely prove incorrect. It left the entire society without a functional framework for responding to the crisis, because the only response the system permitted was more of the same. More ritual, more blood, more temples. The system could not adapt because its own logic forbade the recognition that adaptation was necessary. The kings could not admit that their rituals had failed without destroying the basis of their own authority. And so the rituals continued and the rains did not come, and the people eventually reached their own conclusions and left. This is not a lesson about the environment exactly, though the environment is central to the story. It is a lesson about the relationship between a society's explanatory frameworks and its capacity to respond to change. Every complex society operates within a set of assumptions about how the world works, assumptions that are for as long as they hold invisible, because they are embedded in every institution, every ritual, every distribution of power and resource. The Maya assumption was that sacred ritual controlled natural forces. The assumption held for centuries. When it broke, it took the civilization with it, not because the assumption was uniquely foolish, but because it was uniquely central, so deeply woven into the structure of Maya life, that its failure left no alternative framework standing. The question the Maya collapse poses is not whether our own assumptions will prove equally fragile. It is whether we would recognize the moment if they did. But that question belongs to us, not to the Maya. Their story, the one we have followed from the first carved stelae to the last sealed jar from the brilliant white cities to the green world that reclaimed them, is complete in its own terms, not as a solved mystery, not as a cautionary tale, but as a human story of extraordinary achievement, extraordinary vulnerability, and extraordinary endurance. The cities fell silent. The people did not. The forest grew over the plazas, and the monkeys called from the temple peaks and far away in the highlands and along the coasts and in the small villages of the Yucatan. The descendants of the builders kept speaking, kept weaving, kept planting the corn in the old way, kept watching the sky for the signs that the rain would come. They are watching still. The story has not ended. It has only grown quieter, like the sound of water moving through limestone in the darkness beneath the earth. Patient, continuous, and older than any monument built to contain it. Stela 11 at Tikal is still standing. The limestone has weathered unevenly over the centuries. Some of the glyphs are crisp enough to read. Others have softened into suggestions of the forms they once held, their edges rounded by rain and the slow chemistry of moss. The king carved on its surface still sits in his ceremonial posture, still holds the symbols of his office, still faces outward toward a plaza that no longer gathers anyone to witness him. The date beside him, 869. AD still marks the last moment this city chose to speak in the language of carved stone. From where we stand, now having followed the long thread of the story from that final monument, through the layers of evidence beneath it, the stela looks different than it did at the beginning. Not larger, not more dramatic. Quieter, perhaps. Less like an ending and more like a last line written in a book whose reader closed it gently and set it down. We have moved through a great deal of evidence tonight: sediment cores and oxygen isotopes, pollen counts and population estimates, the shifting iconography of warfare, the unfinished construction projects, the sealed jars, the cooking fires on palace floors. We have followed the traces as far as they lead, and they lead as traces often do to a place where certainty thins and honest uncertainty begins. The classic Maya collapse was not a single event with a single cause. It was a process long uneven, different in its particulars from city to city and decade to decade, and the evidence we have, substantial as it is, illuminates portions of that process while leaving others in shadow. The drought was real. The deforestation was real. The wars were real. The abandonment of the cities was real. But the precise way these pressures interacted, the exact sequence in which they compounded the specific weight each one carried in any given community's decision to stay or to leave these things, resist the clean resolution that narrative instinctively seeks. And that is not a failure of the evidence or of the scholars who have spent lifetimes studying it. It is simply the nature of the past. History does not owe us clarity. It offers what it has preserved: fragments, patterns, chemical signatures, the shape of an absence, where a voice used to be, and leaves the rest to the patience of those willing to sit with what is incomplete. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the value of a story like this one lies not in the answer it provides, but in the quality of attention. It asks of us the willingness to look carefully at a world that is not our own, to hold its complexity without rushing to reduce it, and to recognize in its silences something that is not emptiness, but simply a different kind of presence. The Maya did not vanish. Their descendants are planting corn this season in the same highlands where their ancestors watched the same stars. The languages are still spoken. The looms still carry thread. The story continues in forms that no stela records and no sediment core preserves, carried forward in the quietest and most durable of all human technologies, memory passed from one voice to the next, across the kind of distance that stone cannot hold, but a living language can. One question remains, and it is not one we need to answer tonight. The Maya believed the universe moved in great cycles, creation and dissolution growth, and silence the long count, turning over and beginning again. Their calendar measured time not as a line stretching towards some final destination, but as a wheel returning always to positions it had occupied before. If they were right, not literally perhaps, but in the rhythm of the intuition, then the silence of the southern cities is not a conclusion. It is a pause in a pattern too large for any single generation to see whole. Whether the pattern holds, or what it might mean if it does, is a question the evidence will not answer. It belongs to the kind of knowing that lives closer to sleep than to waking. And sleep is where we are headed now. Let the image of the plaza settle the moss on the carved stone, the green light filtering through the canopy, the sound of the howler monkeys filling the space between the temples with a voice that is not human but is not silence either. The city rests. The forest breathes around it in its slow, patient rhythm, the same rhythm it has kept since the last footsteps faded from the causeways and the first seedlings took root in the cracks of the plaster. You've travelled a long way tonight, through centuries and through stone, and there is nothing more that needs holding. Let the distance close. Let the details soften. Let the story settle into the place where stories go, when they have been heard, not forgotten, not resolved, just resting the way the cities rest, beneath the trees. Sleep well, traveller. The corn is still growing somewhere. The rain will come or it will not, and the land will remember either way.